late 1950s, a wave of Puerto Rican migrants arrived in the northern neighborhoods of Chicago, seeking new opportunities but instead finding themselves in a harsh and unwelcoming city. Construction projects like the Dan Ryan and Kennedy Expressways, alongside the new University of Illinois campus, forced these families to relocate, scattering into neighborhoods like Lincoln Park, Lakeview, Uptown, and Humboldt Park. This migration was not without challenges. As these neighborhoods were predominantly white, tensions quickly escalated. Puerto Rican families were often met with hostility, and their children became the targets of racial violence. The streets were dangerous, and it became clear that something needed to change. The year was 1963, and Puerto Rican youths found themselves in a constant battle for survival. White gangs saw them as invaders, moving into their territories, and began to viciously attack these young people. The struggle to defend themselves birthed several fledgling gangs, each attempting to protect their communities. In the Lakeview area, two groups in particular stood out, the Top Cats and the Emerald Knights. These were not organized criminal gangs, but rather groups of young Puerto Rican men who banded together for mutual protection. They met at Lemoyne Playground outside of Lemoyne Elementary School, where they made a historic decision to join forces and create a single, unified group. They called themselves the Latin Eagles. The Latin Eagles made their home at Grace and Wilton, and this small corner of Lakeview would become their stronghold for years to come. They were more than just a group of street toughs, they were the protectors of their community, defending Puerto Rican families from the ever-present threat of violence and racism. As the years passed, the Latin Eagles found themselves at the center of growing tensions. Rival gangs like the Harrison Gents and Latin Kings, both of which included Puerto Rican members, sought to recruit the same young people the Eagles were trying to protect. The Latin Kings, in particular, wanted to expand their influence into Lakeview, setting the stage for a bloody confrontation. In 1966, the conflict escalated when the Latin Eagles killed the leader of the Harrison Gents. This set off a series of retaliations that would last for nearly a decade. Just 2 years later, the Gents struck back, beating the first Latin Eagle to death, a young man named Hipólito Vega. His death would become a rallying point for the Eagles, who memorialized Vega by painting his name on murals throughout their territory. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the Latin Eagles grew in numbers and influence. Their relationship with the Young Lords, a Puerto Rican political organization, allowed them to combine street power with activism. While the Young Lords fought for equality through protests and political movements, the Latin Eagles were the guardians of the streets, providing physical protection to Puerto Rican families. In 1978, the Latin Eagles reached a turning point when they were invited to join the Folk Alliance, a coalition of gangs that had been formed in the prison system. The Folk Alliance brought together Latino and Black gangs, including the Black Gangster Disciples, under a common banner. The Eagles' inclusion in this alliance solidified their position as one of Chicago's most powerful street organizations. But it wasn't just about power. The Eagles, along with other Latino gangs like the Maniac Latin Disciples and Spanish Cobras, formed the United Latino Organization, ULO. This was a new kind of alliance, one focused on uniting Latino gangs to protect their communities from external threats. Together, they controlled large swaths of territory, keeping rival gangs and outside influences at bay. The Latin Eagles' reach extended far beyond Lakeview. By the mid-1980s, they had expanded into the Hermosa neighborhood, a predominantly Mexican and Puerto Rican area. Here, the Eagles became a dominant force, working alongside the Spanish Cobras and Maniac Latin Disciples to control the streets of Kelvin Park. In Hermosa, the Latin Eagles thrived, recruiting new members from the growing Mexican population and solidifying their position as one of the city's most formidable street organizations. But even as they grew in strength, the Latin Eagles faced new challenges. The streets of Chicago were becoming increasingly violent, and the alliances that had once held strong began to fracture. In 1989, a fateful event occurred that would change everything. The Latin Eagles threw a party at Caguas nightclub in the Logan Square neighborhood. It was meant to be a celebration, with their allies from the Spanish Cobras and Maniac Latin Disciples in attendance. But the night took a dark turn when a fight broke out, leading to the death of a Wrigleyville Latin Eagle named Lil Rook. The death of Lil Rook marked the beginning of a bloody war between the Latin Eagles and the Spanish Cobras. The once strong alliance within the ULO began to crumble, and soon, the streets of Chicago were engulfed in gang warfare. By 1992, the Folk Alliance was splitting into factions. The Latin Eagles chose not to align themselves with either the Insanes or the Maniacs. Instead, they formed their own coalition with the Simon City Royals and Insane Popes, calling themselves Almighty. This new unofficial family of gangs gave the Eagles a new sense of identity and power. As the 1990s progressed, the Latin Eagles began to withdraw from their original stronghold in Lakeview. The area had become increasingly dangerous, plagued by drugs and crime. They allowed the gangster disciples to take control of much of Wrigleyville, though this relationship would eventually sour, leading to yet another conflict. But even as they left Lakeview, the Eagles' legacy lived on. Their influence in Hermosa remained strong, and their history as protectors of the Puerto Rican people could not be erased. By the late 1990s, the Latin Eagles were at war once again. The death of one of their members, known as Mono, at the hands of the Spanish Cobras reignited old rivalries, leading to a full-scale war with the Insanes. Despite the constant conflict, the Latin Eagles had left an indelible mark on the city of Chicago. They had grown from a small group of young men defending their community into one of the city's most powerful street organizations. And while their story is one of violence and struggle, it is also a story of survival, unity, and a fierce commitment to their people. Today, the Latin Eagles continue to hold territory in Chicago, their legacy cemented in the streets they once fought to protect. From their origins in Lakeview to their rise in Hermosa, their story is a reflection of the Puerto Rican experience in Chicago, a story of resilience, pride, and an unwavering will to stand against adversity.